Welcome everyone to our public forum on 21st century nuclear challenges. Thank you for all coming out today, especially on this grisly day. The proliferation of nuclear weapons really does represent one of the greatest security threats that we face today. And this is especially true with the geographic spread of nuclear weapons to near and even to potentially non-state actors, including terrorist organizations. Indeed, nuclear weapons represent, even though there are many security threats we face, nuclear weapons really only represent the truly only existential threat that we face today. So we are honored to have here today two experts in the field of nuclear nonproliferation, Mr. William Tobey and Dr. Christopher Ford. Dr. Ford is Director of the Center for Technology and Global Security and Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. He served until September 2008 as United States Special Representative for Nuclear Nonproliferation. He also served as General Counsel to the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Intelligence in the wake of the September 11 terrorist attacks. Mr. William Tobey is Senior Fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. He is former Deputy Administrator for Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation at the National Nuclear Security Administration. He participated in international negotiations, nuclear negotiations, ranging from the START talks with the Soviet Union to the six-party talks with North Korea. Before we move forward, I want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors for the event, the Department of Political Science and International Affairs here at Kennesaw, the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Policy at Georgia Tech, the Hudson Institute, the Partnership for a Secure America, and the Stanley Foundation. Mr. Tobey and Dr. Ford will deliver some opening statements, and then we'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. So without further ado, first, Mr. William Tobey.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. We've divided our responsibilities to an extent, so I'm going to talk about the threat of nuclear terrorism. Chris will deal with the relations between states that have nuclear weapons. And I think we're both prepared to deal with some of the issues related to proliferation, for example, the issues of Iran and North Korea, and other states that might be working to attain a nuclear weapons capability. I believe that the nuclear terrorism threat is one of the most severe threats that faces the United States today. But you don't have to take my word for it. Every major presidential candidate since September 11th has said that it's at the top of his list, her list, of threats that face America. And the reasons for this, I believe, are threefold. First, we live in an age of unlimited terrorism. This was not always the case. Terrorists today seek to inflict maximum possible carnage. But in 1986, there was a national intelligence estimate produced by the CIA that concluded two things. The NIE has since been declassified. Its conclusions were that if terrorists acquired sufficient fissile material, either highly enriched uranium or plutonium, or stole a weapon, they could probably detonate it. But the second part of the intelligence estimate was that terrorists would probably not do so because it would be antithetical to their.
The backlash would be so strong, the consequences so great that it would destroy what they would hope to attain in terms of political objectives. Today's terrorists are different. Al-Qaeda seeks to inflict maximum possible damage. And while bin Laden has been killed, Al-Qaeda has not been completely eradicated. And there have been other groups that have sought also to inflict enormous damage. You can look at the case of Beslan in Russia, where a school with hundreds of children was attacked on the opening day classes, and children and their parents were essentially taken prisoner, and many of them later died. People who are willing to do things like that probably know no boundaries. The second aspect of our life that makes the nuclear terrorism threat greater than it had been is access to nuclear technology, which is today basically ubiquitous. There's more computing power in my iPhone than was available to the scientists on Los Alamos Mesa in 1945 who were working to make the first atomic weapon. Access to the internet is worldwide, and within the internet there is a lot of information that would be useful to make a nuclear weapon. Computer-aided design and manufacturing systems exist in dozens, maybe scores of countries around the world, and all could be put to use to make nuclear weapons. In some, what had been the cutting edge of technology is now very well developed technology and is more of an engineering problem than a science problem. The third factor that heightens the nuclear terrorism threat is that nuclear material is not sufficiently secured. You need plutonium or highly enriched uranium to make a nuclear weapon. The International Atomic Energy Agency has documented 18 different cases in which this material has been seized outside the control of governments. So in 18 different cases over the last 20 years roughly, admittedly small amounts of this material has been taken through sting operations and border crossings because of radiation detectors that the United States has installed, or in one way or another taken from people who shouldn't have had it. Now, admittedly these were small quantities, but in many cases it was advertised to be a sample of a larger amount. And the extent that these quantities are seeping away from nuclear facilities shows that those facilities are not secure. We can have no confidence in the overall security until these seizures stop. What's to be done about this? I think a fourfold effort is important. First, we need to, and many of these steps have are already underway, but more work needs to be done. First, we need to improve nuclear security, the security of fissile materials, plutonium and highly enriched uranium. The United States has done enormous work in Russia and elsewhere. In Russia, we've worked at 148 different sites around the country, securing either weapons or fissile material. And Presidents Putin and Bush agreed in 2005 to accelerate that effort under what was called the Bratislava Initiative. And that work was basically completed at the end of 2008. But still, more work needs to be done, and we need to sustain those efforts. In terms of additional work, there are some 120 research reactors around the world that use highly enriched uranium. And while 60-some of those reactors have either been converted to low-enriched uranium, the rest need to either be converted or closed, because that material can be used directly, that fuel can be used directly to make weapons. The second major area of work that requires attention is international engagement. We've seen enormous changes in the world, and it had been early on in our nuclear age, treaty organizations, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or formal organizations like the International Atomic Energy Agency were the primary means to limit proliferation. But we found that with the advent of organizations like AQCOM's Proliferation Network, which took nuclear bomb-making know-how developed and used by Pakistan and spread it to countries like Libya, North Korea, and Iran, we needed to be more nimble. Similarly, the threat posed by Al-Qaeda required a faster action than could be possible in forming treaties. So United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540 was passed in 2004, which required that states criminalize the proliferation of weapons usable material to non-state actors, enact and enforce effective export controls, and secure the material within their own borders. That wasn't enough, though. You can pass a law and say that states need to get control of this material, but many of them didn't have the capacity to do so. So the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism was formed. And today it numbers some 80 partner countries, and they work together to improve practices ranging from material security to border controls to intelligence to emergency response, the whole spectrum of what's necessary to defeat the nuclear terrorist threat. The third major area of work that's required are specific steps where we have not, where we've failed to take action. And I would include in this area examples such as additional intelligence and law enforcement information sharing, particularly between the United States and Russia, and also examining the causes. I referred to, of our failures, I referred to the 18 different cases in which fissile material has been found outside the control of governments. In only one of those cases do we understand what facility the material came from, who took it, how it got out of the facility, who might have abetted the theft, and where it was headed. And until governments get to the bottom of these cases, we can't be sure that the facilities, the remaining facilities, are in fact secure. The fourth major area of work is curbing nuclear programs in dangerous countries. And this is a very, very difficult problem. I would argue that the threat to the Non-Proliferation Treaty is acute but limited. It's specific. There are a few countries that pose a significant threat: Iran, North Korea, and perhaps Syria. But so far, we've been able to avoid a cascade of proliferation following on some of our failures. The number of countries with nuclear weapons today is the same as it was 20 years ago. One additional country, North Korea, acquired the capacity. One country, South Africa, eliminated the capacity. So we haven't seen the kind of cascade of proliferation that was projected in the 1960s, but I think that vigorous efforts will be required to make sure that remains the case. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. I thought for my part I would back the focus out a bit and shift from the very practical anti-nuclear terrorism concerns that Will was talking about to offer a little perspective on much more of a broad brush picture of nuclear weapons policy in a more general sense, with a particular focus on state versus state interactions and how nuclear weapons play in the decision-making of particular countries, what role they have in the international security environment, which I think is an important prerequisite really for helping understand wherever you think nuclear weapons policy should go. I think being able to understand to some extent how we got to where we are today and something about the deeply entangled ways in which nuclear weapons have ended up being part of the fabric of national policymaking in a number of countries, directly and indirectly, in ways both obvious and inobvious, and entangled with how the international security environment functions. Without understanding a bit of the complexities there, I think it's very hard to think very usefully about where nuclear policy should go, whatever your favorite outcome is. If you're talking about limiting the number of players, you're talking about what the optimum number of participants in a nuclearized world should be, whether that is 0 or a small number or a large number, who the players should be, what force postures they should have, what is the optimal answer from a policy perspective. All of this, I think, requires understanding more than one commonly hears in everyday discourse on this in the public about how it is that we got to where we are. So let me just very quickly start by making what I feel like is a fairly obvious point, but it sometimes gets overlooked. It is commonly suggested that nuclear weapons are only useful for deterring the use of other nuclear weapons. If I accomplish nothing else, I hope I can disabuse you of that. I think it is an unfortunately far more complicated and problematic than that. And I guess to help understand that, one need go no further back than to the first development of nuclear weapons and indeed their first use in 1945. This was in connection, obviously, with a conventional war, a pre-nuclear war, if you will, and was not the outgrowth of a nuclear arms race in any kind of direct fashion. These are factors which I think is important to remember later when we look at how weapons function in the world today. Have read, there was a very elaborate plan for international control of nuclear technology, pursuant to which the U.S. and all other possessors of technology were planning for the possibility of turning over all such tools to an international authority, in effect, so that no country would have access even to dual-use technology, much less nuclear weapons themselves. That didn't survive the Soviet Union's quest for nuclear weaponry, but it did, at least in the early days of the UN, receive considerable majorities and sent a very young and much smaller organization. But it wasn't long, of course, before the arms race was on. But I think remembering the prehistory of the arms race in a conventional war, desperate and bloody struggle, is important to understand something about how some players, though perhaps no longer the United States, view these things today. But the arms race is now over. Why are these things still around? I think from a U.S. perspective, speaking very parochially, to some extent they are still around because we can't figure out a way to get rid of them in a way that doesn't leave the world a worse place than it started, and leave our security in a worse place than it started. I think you can probably imagine that from a specifically United States perspective, if one had a magic spell that would make all nuclear weaponry disappear overnight, there are some things that you might imagine folks in Washington applauding. We are the preeminent conventional military power on the planet, and you could imagine a very simple discourse that would say, well, gosh, what's not to like about abolition? And there may be some who would sort of support it for those very reasons, but of course we don't have a magic spell to do that. And over the time frames in which it would, if it's imaginable at all, over the time frames in which it would be possible to imagine abolition occurring, we don't know much about what the situation would be at the end of that pipeline, and whether we would be as happy with the resulting conventional balance of power in the world as we imagine ourselves being were to happen next Tuesday. These in reality are much more complicated projections than you might imagine. And I think it also needs to be emphasized that to the extent that we think that the weapons have played any role in, for example, dissuading great powers from warring directly against each other, which is not the same thing as having proxy conflicts elsewhere in the world and all that sort of thing. But in terms of direct great power on great power conflict of the sort that Europe became all too accustomed to for so many years, to the extent that they play any role in deterring that, or the extent to which they play any role in deterring the proliferation of nuclear weaponry, then presumably a world in which we've got down to very low numbers for zero is one in which we must need to be prepared to shoulder even greater burdens in somehow managing to make up for whatever security impact they once had. In other words, this is not a simple calculation. And if you've been paying attention to me this late in the afternoon, you may have noticed I snuck something interesting into that last few sentences. I mentioned the possibility of nuclear weapons being used as a tool to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons. There's something sort of paradoxical on the surface about that, I recognize. But I think it's long been a part of U.S. strategic thinking, and I think that in quite a few other countries around the world. And I'm referring to the phenomenon of what is called extended nuclear deterrence. During the Cold War, a number of countries did start off down the road to having their own nuclear weapons programs. They were, in most cases, dissuaded from completing that journey, in part on the strength of security guarantees that their allies, most often the United States, offered them. You don't need to do that because we will make sure that your fundamental security interests are safeguarded. It was the general line of argument. This was effective with respect to some countries in East Asia, South Korea, and Taiwan. It was effective with regard to some European countries, Sweden, Switzerland, for instance. And it was on the strength of those security guarantees, which of course were not wholly based upon our nuclear arsenal, but which were underpinned in important ways by the fact that we possessed a powerful nuclear arsenal. And in the context of the Cold War, that was particularly important. And the persuasive factor of those security guarantees, underpinned in part by nuclear weaponry, was important in dissuading countries from completing the route to nuclear weaponry. And I think this dynamic, although it's a different world in many ways, thankfully, than it was during the Cold War, this dynamic is still an important factor in international affairs. There are, particularly in East Asia, I think there are powerful things to be said for the presence of not just a U.S. military commitment, but in fact a military commitment underpinned, at least to some degree, by nuclear weaponry, in making it unnecessary, or perceived to be unnecessary for certain countries that would find it very easy to go down that route if they wish to, Japan, South Korea perhaps, to take that step, in part because they feel that they don't need to because we are there for them. And I think it's not for nothing that you see after the North Korean nuclear test in 2006, for instance, the very first thing the U.S. government did was put Condi Rice on a plane, fly her to Tokyo for consultations with the Japanese government, in which she reassured them as firmly as it was possible for her to do that we would be there for them in a pinch and that no, their security was not deeply and fundamentally threatened by North Korea's development of nuclear weapons, because we were, in a sense, still going to be there for them as their closest military ally. Prime Minister Terahashi, or Foreign Minister Terahashi, was quite good about coming forward and more or less saying explicitly that Japan has no interest in nuclear weaponry, in part because, you mentioned the metaphorical arm around Secretary Rice, in part because the U.S. is there for us. So I think this is a dynamic that we can't forget as we project nuclear policy forward into the mid-21st century. It is a significant thing that it is possible, at least in the right circumstances, for nuclear weapons to help deter not just the use of nuclear weapons, or even deter all-out conventional attack, which I'll get to in a second, but also, in fact, to deter proliferation. It is paradoxical, but I think it is quite a potent factor. And this phenomenon of extended deterrence, I think, also highlights that bit that I mentioned a moment ago. The utility of nuclear weapons, at least potentially, deterring significant conventional conflict. And I alluded a moment ago to dissuading great power on great power conflict. And I think it needs to be, extended deterrence points us to that to some extent, because it was not simply nuclear attack that we have for many years reassured our allies against. In many contexts, it was in fact conventional.
So that means
From a U.S. and a British and a French perspective during the Cold War, for instance, it was quite important that we emphasize nuclear weapons and indeed early nuclear use, first use potentially, in our strategic planning, in part because we were concerned about what was perceived to be very dramatically dangerous Warsaw Pact numerical superiority in Central Europe. Now, thankfully, those concerns don't affect us anymore. But I think it's a point worth making that there are certainly countries, if not perhaps us now, there are countries around the world and historically have long been countries around the world who have placed great stock in nuclear weaponry as a way of deterring conventional threats. Israel today presumably has a great interest in keeping numerically larger, potentially hostile Arab armies at bay. Pakistan, although it probably has many reasons for having pursued nuclear weapons, has some reason to be concerned about a numerically and probably technologically superior Indian force. India also, I suspect, had lots of different mixed motives, but it cannot have escaped their attention when they began their nuclear weapons program in the early 60s. They had just been invaded by China in 1962, in a purely conventional conflict. And South Africa, I should stress, developed its nuclear weapons not out of fear of anyone else's nuclear weapons, but out of a conviction that they faced in their circumstances of the 70s and 80s, what they described as sort of a total onslaught of what was perceived to be communist-led insurgency sweeping down across the continent toward them. They viewed nuclear weapons in a complicated way as an answer to that purely conventional, indeed, almost to some extent, partly domestic security threat abetted by overseas planes. But the most important way in which I think this factor plays into the modern world is perhaps in Russia itself. It appears to feel weak and dysfunctional in purely conventional military terms, outclassed by NATO technology, outclassed by Chinese numbers, and perhaps very soon by Chinese technology. And it prizes nuclear weapons as a way of at least potentially being able to make up for such things. Russian nuclear doctrine emphasizes early use. It emphasizes de-escalatory use, which is an interesting concept that we ourselves stressed at various points during the Cold War, at least theoretically. So this is an important consideration from Moscow's perspective. North Korea cites U.S. military deployments, not just nuclear weapons, but military alliances generally in South Korea and in Japan as a justification, it claims, for its own nuclear pursuits. And Iran, of course, frequently invokes the specter of attack from the United States and Israel to at least implicitly justify its own nuclear weapons ambitions. So I think life would probably be simpler if nuclear weapons only deterred other nuclear weapons, but life isn't that simple. And even the International Court of Justice, in its famous advisory opinion on nuclear weapons in 1996, saw fit to leave open the loophole of lawful nuclear weapons use in response to what's in fact an existential threat on a possessor country. Let me mention two quick final factors before concluding and opening it up to a much more useful and interesting question and answer session. I should flag your attention to the possibility, at least, that nuclear weapons can play a role in deterring the use of other types of weapons of mass destruction. I refer to this as cross-deterrence. And this may not be a huge factor, but it's a non-trivial one. At least historically has had some significance in various countries' plans. When we in the United States gave up our biological weapons program, under the Nixon administration, for instance, it was said that we did not need to worry about that, notwithstanding the fact that there were concerns, even at the time, that some other countries might still secretly be pursuing biological weapons program. Because if it really came to it, we could deter the use of BW against us by virtue of relying upon our nuclear arsenal. If you anthrax us, we'll nuke you, sort of the implication there. So there was an explicit idea that nuclear weapons could play a role in deterring other WMD use. And I think that has survived to the present day. If you want a suggestion to this effect, look at the Obama administration's 2010 nuclear policy, which quite explicitly reserves the option of modifying our declaratory policy if need be in the face of biological weapons threats. So this is not just a sort of an academic wrinkle. This is at least theoretically still a part of declaratory policy, the most significant nuclear player in the world. And it's not just the U.S. Syria has long been thought to maintain a chemical weapons stockpile in part as a sort of potential response to Israeli nuclear capability. Iran's nuclear program began in the 1980s, probably not in any way a result of U.S. or Israeli nuclear capabilities, but in fact as a result of Iraq's use of chemical weapons against Iran. So this is I think, a factor that you shouldn't dismiss in trying to assess why it is that countries might either obtain or maintain nuclear weapons capabilities. And if you want to do anything significant in changing the balance of nuclear forces around the world, being able to answer questions about whether and how this function might be handled in other ways is very important. Finally, let me point out an omission in my own remarks. So far, I've been talking very much in a kind of realpolitik game theoretical way about how you calculate deterrent balances against others, what the right force posture should be, and that kind of thing. But nuclear weapons can, and I think do, in very complex and sometimes troubling ways, play roles in the international political system well beyond just that kind of game theoretical calculation. I think in certain circumstances and for certain countries, they can play important roles in getting wrapped up in the political identity, if you will, of particular governments or polities, the ways in which countries conceive of their own mission and role in the world. There's an interesting work on this in India with respect to development of the Indian program, and it's being wrapped up in all kinds of post-colonial insecurities of the neighbor government, for instance. There's interesting work on this in a number of other places, but let me, before I conclude, just flag in particular Russia, because this has an important bearing on how far it is we can imagine things going in the strategic arms control arena with them. And that is to point out that I think, before I conclude, Putin-era Russia, my impression is that it has invested enormous self-identity in its possession of nuclear weapons. This is a country that frankly doesn't have all that much to offer as the sort of symbolic frontage of its continued great power status, even as it is nostalgic for the old days of Soviet importance. And one of the few things that they can latch on to, and appear to latch on to in their self-identity in the world as a great power, is there are some sort of the only remaining real island of excellence, if you will, in a sort of scary way that remains available to the Kremlin. And I think we would be wise not to underestimate that as a factor in how it is they approach arms control issues, how it is they approach questions of disarmament, how it is they approach questions of strategic stability in Asia, and this kind of thing. So there's an identity factor, a political, psychological wrinkle to weapons possession, which I think can be very important and must be taken into consideration somehow as we try to grapple with nuclear policy issues looking forward. So what's the conclusion of all this? I'm not going to offer you any detailed things. We can get into policy prescriptions in the Q&A perhaps. But I want to emphasize one thing, and that is that if there is anything we can be certain of in these very complicated and feedback questions, it is that simple answers, the proverbial bumper sticker solution to nuclear policy. One should go to nuclear zero. One should have unequivocal peace through unlimited strength. One should proliferate until everyone's secure through a system of universal deterrence. Simple answers are probably wrong answers. And these answers that we, as we grapple with them, the only way to a sensible policy outcome is to be acutely, painfully, and always aware of how complicated the entanglement of nuclear weaponry is with international politics. Because if we want to piece that apart, it's going to take a lot of hard work and sustained attention. You're going to need a lot more from us than simple answers and PowerPoint presentations of how we're going to solve this problem. But with that said, I'd love to get into Q&A. We'd be happy to take some questions you'd like. Are you a master of ceremonies?
Yes, well, thank you for your informative and compelling comments. And we would like to open it up now to the audience for questions, comments.
Thanks very much for your remarks. Iran seems to be a very big problem, and while we've all been focusing on Tunisia and Libya and Egypt, it's almost as though they've been asleep as to what is going on in Iran. And Iran's got some kind of support from Russia and from China, and both of those are members of the permanent Security Council, the permanent members, both are nuclear powers. How is the United States going to get Russia and China on board to contain Iran, who is a state sponsor of international terrorism?
Well, I think you've raised a very important and difficult question. I believe that the decision as to whether or not Iran will achieve a nuclear weapons capability lies in Tehran. It's no longer a decision that can be taken in Washington or New York or the United Nations or Moscow or Beijing. To the extent that we might have been able to influence that through sanctions or other measures, I think it would have taken tougher action years ago. And I agree with the premise of one of your questions that so far Russia and China have shielded Iran. They've watered down the sanctions, they've delayed them, they've shown, in fact, in their response to the latest IAEA report, International Atomic Energy report, which detail weapons-related activities in Iran, that they're willing to sort of turn a blind eye to the situation. You asked, well, how are we going to get Russia and China to help contain Iran? And that I think our choices are probably down to military action, which carries with it significant disadvantages and would delay but not end the program, or containment of Iran through deterrence and building coalitions in the region. Neither of those alternatives are very appealing, but I'm afraid that our options have dwindled too little.
If I might add, this also presents some, what I think are some very troubling questions for how we handle proliferation challenges in the future. Proliferators, they read the papers too, and they learn how we struggle to deal with the case du jour with respect to how they might want to present us with the case of tomorrow. I think Iran has learned a great deal from North Korea's playbook in this respect, and I fear that someone down the line will learn a great deal from Iran's playbook. And the international community hasn't precisely distinguished itself with being able to apply tough enough sanctions early enough, for instance, to make that a very creditable option. We have ended up reacting to Iranian provocations by progressively tougher and tougher measures, and I suppose we deserve some credit for that, but our timing's wrong. Had we done in 2003 the kind of thing that we are now willing to do in 2011, perhaps it would have had some significant influence on changing the course of their program. My fear, however, is that we have this sort of terrible collective action problem in the international compliance enforcement world, in the sense that what is saleable early, when it would be most useful, is not effective. I mean, what would be saleable early is not effective. What is saleable after considerable provocation is, by that point, ineffective based upon the circumstances that have developed up to that point. We've done too little, we've done it too late. And how we address next time is a very, very challenging question, and a lot of it depends upon where we go now. The story of Iran is not over, and the message that is sent to the future by what policy choices are made in dealing with Iran is not a closed book yet. And I hope the policy community can somehow find the wisdom to act effectively on this, so that the story at the end of the day will not be one in which the message to the future is not, here is how you defy the international community and get away with this, but it is one in which they end up being stopped, or even if they succeed, the message is that, wow, they succeeded, but that sure wasn't very pleasant for them. This is not something I want to consider for my country. That life of isolation and pressure and countervailing coalitions is not a situation that I want to get myself into. So that even if they end up getting the weapon that they appear to desire, the moral of the story will be one in which the conclusion for others in the future is that this is an unprofitable, unrewarding, painful, and debilitating experience that will be hopefully much more unattractive than it is apparently seen to those who've engaged in it. So the jury is still out.
I just would like to get your views on the somewhat debilitating nature of our anti-missile defense system toward nuclear deterrence. You have our anti-missile defense system. You have China wanting to increase their nuclear stockpile so they can negate our missile defense system, and Russia does not want to decrease their stockpiles because they're scared of China increasing their stockpiles. And I was just wondering if you see our missile defense system as the technology becomes better, it actually being a real threat to nuclear deterrence.
Well, the missile defense system that's contemplated by the present administration, American administration, the Obama administration, is a limited one and is designed against limited attacks that might originate from North Korea or Iran. It's clearly been of concern to both Russia and China. I don't think it would have a decisive impact on Russian forces. It would be overwhelmed quickly by the size of the Russian arsenal. The Chinese forces are smaller, but their definition of deterrence is also different. They don't seek to inflict as much damage as the Russians do, and as a consequence, they pursue a smaller arsenal, at least so far. There's a paradox here because, as was noted earlier, Russia and China have shielded Iran. Arguably, China has shielded North Korea. And so the U.S. response has been, well, if we can't get what we need through negotiation, we need to begin to defend ourselves with missile defense. And so it should be an incentive for Russia and China to apply more pressure in the Iran and North Korea situations, but so far it hasn't worked that way. I don't think that it ultimately changes the strategic balance with Russia and probably not with China. And so I don't think it's a threat to strategic stability.
There was a time when U.S. planners at least envisioned the theoretical possibility, if you go back to President Reagan's 1983 Strategic Defense Initiative speech, there was at least contemplation of the possibility of moving to an entirely different approach to strategic deterrence, which revolved around defense rather than offense. Over the years, I think the policy community has kind of congealed on more or less a consensus that ballistic missile defense is important and urgently necessary with regard at least to small-scale threats of the kind that might be presented by a proliferator like Iran or North Korea. So that's why you've seen the Obama administration pursuing what would have been by 1990 standards an extraordinarily, outrageously ambitious ballistic missile defense program, and yet conservatives complain that that represents a scaling back to some extent to the Bush administration plans. But under nobody's planning, and I frankly think in modern Washington, no imaginable ballistic missile defense budget, are we likely to have anything that would be a significant threat to Russia or Chinese nuclear arsenals. And to some extent, this is evidence of how we should be thankful that we're in a situation where the principal axis of defense focus is not the possibility of an all-out nuclear war with a rival with whom we're in this desperate contest for the future of the world. That's yesterday. Today, we're not thinking about Russia or China, and I suspect they're not thinking about us, though they sometimes bluster to the contrary in those kinds of zero-sum nuclear deterrence terms. principally our concerns for national security on all these parties' parts are elsewhere. And I think the fact that we're spending so much time worrying about, I mean, it's terribly depressing to worry about rogue regime proliferation and that kind of thing, and how we defend against North Korea and Iranian missiles, for instance. But frankly, in the scheme of things, it's a whole lot better to worry about that than to be in the old sort of game theoretical offense-defense challenges of how you think about ballistic missile defense in the Cold War. We're not there anymore, and we are working as hard as we can to address today's threats. And in the scheme of things, we should be happy about it.
To take a step back, I do think that Iran did learn a lot from North Korea's playbook, as you said. There was no big international response when they tested nuclear missile weapon and all that. So Israel's a different player in the game. They actually did attack, Iraqi nuclear weapons and facilities and all that. So what do you think the U.S. role will be in bringing in Israeli military intervention? If that was to happen.
That's a question du jour. I would actually add to your list Syria, the 2007 strike on the reactor there. It's hard to say what Israel will wish to do. And the press is full of all kinds of word speculation about this. I don't know precisely where they stand. And in this respect, we were talking a bit about this earlier today. I encourage people to remember that these decisions are not ones that are made against a blank slate. It is very possible in the policy world to have a suite of options available to you that are all bad to varying degrees. And it's not a question of choosing anything that's necessarily unequivocally good. If you've got one of those, good for you, but it's not going to happen all the time. And my suspicion is that the answer to what Israel will want to do, and therefore what the United States will be in a position to potentially have to deal with, or to restrain them from doing, or to encourage them to do, as the case may be, is going to depend upon what their calculation comes out to be. And in that respect, it's hard to say where Israel is. You see lots of, their government is in many ways, policy community is in many ways as cacophonous and multi-minded as our own. I don't know where their heart of hearts is, if indeed they know at this point. It is possible that a strike on Iran would be considered the least awful of the options available to them. I don't know. It's possible that it would be considered the least awful of options available to us, or perhaps a strike by the Israelis might be considered the least awful of options available to us. I don't know. I'm not sure how to answer the question other than to agree with you that this is hugely salient, and I don't quite know where it's going.
When I was working on the National Security Council staff in late 2005 and early 2006, I was convinced actually that Israel was about to strike them. Their rhetoric was to talk about a point of no return and not allowing Iran to get to the point of no return. And of course, what I outlined regarding an earlier question was essentially that Iran is past that point, that the decision now about whether it's going to attain a nuclear capability is theirs, not ours. So obviously I was wrong in that judgment 5 years ago. I still think, and part of why I was wrong was, I believe in retrospect, it's in Israel's interest to appear like it's about to strike for 2 reasons. First, it might deter the Iranians. Second, it might encourage the rest of the international community to be tougher on Iran because they want to avoid war. And it's also possible that if we really believe that Israel is about to do it, but couldn't do an effective job of it, the United States might be persuaded to assist in the attack. So there are games within games on this question, and I don't know what the thinking in Tel Aviv is.
Or Jerusalem.
I have a question. I wrote it down, please. South Korea currently has a very mixed relationship. It has the security relationship with the United States because the United States provides it with security with respect. Thank you. With respect to North Korea. It also has an economic relationship with China because it's one of its largest trading partners. In the future, South Korea, in my opinion, is going to have to choose between those 2 relationships, the security relationship with the United States and the economic relationship with China. What, in your opinion, will push South Korea to either side, to either the United States or the Chinese actual arena, if that makes sense?
I'm actually not so sure they do have to choose. I mean, we have an economic relationship with China, and we don't have to choose between a relationship with the United States and an economic relationship with China. And I wonder whether, in fact, the question is quite as stark as you suggest. Absent something that would give Beijing a reason to forfeit the benefits, which are very real for Beijing as well, to South Korea of their very rich relationship. I'm not sure that the choice would have to come to that, frankly. I mean, certain places in the peninsula, who knows what might happen in the context of a, for example, a North Korean regime collapse and unification efforts and that kind of thing. But I think I'm not sure that it is quite such a binary choice. One of the interesting things about relations with China in general is that with many countries, including us, is that it's a very strange combination of deep economic partnerships in many respects and a degree of at least potential rivalry. And this is a challenge for security planners all around the Pacific Rim, including in Beijing. These are not the days when you had a sort of semi-autarkic, hostile Soviet bloc with which one had to figure out how to deal. Both of these aspects are important parts of the relationship with China, both for us and for South Korea and for many other countries. And so far we haven't had to choose between these, and it's been the job of policymakers to sometimes desperately tap into in order of having to choose. And I'm not sure that anything presupposes that Seoul will have to end that tap dance anytime soon.
I'd make 2 points. I think relations between the United States and the ROK are as close now as they've been in decades. We just signed or completed the free trade agreement. The military alliance is quite strong. I think part of that is because of the North Korean threat. And secondly, I'd note that if you're a country of 50 million people or so living next to a country of 1.3 billion, you probably want a strong friend.
Did you have a question to follow up?
First of all, thank you for coming. My question to you is, what are the implications of the Syrian weapons stockpile with respect to the revolution of uprising in Syria? So.
I wish we knew enough to answer the question about the Syrian nuclear program. One of the challenges in the non-proliferation world is how utterly resistant the Syrians have been to efforts to assess what indeed went on there, or really anywhere else in the country. They've been steadfast in keeping the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors out, and they've been entirely uncooperative, even as their regime seems to be tottering here in the midst of domestic insurrection, well-deserved domestic insurrection, I should add. It's very alarming. We don't know the extent of any Syrian program. If we do, we don't say so publicly. So the international community as a whole doesn't know. And therefore, it's very hard to assess what kind of problems there will be. I mean, imagine, if you will, a few years ago, before we thankfully managed to negotiate away Muammar Gaddafi's program. It was not a very advanced program, but it had lots of gear stashed away. It was not being used properly for it all, but they had lots of widgets and lots of material with which terrible mischief could have been done. Had Libya events of 2010, 2011 happened in 2002, the potential for all kinds of things to run around the world with even more alacrity than the non-network had begun to arrange very trouble. And I think we don't know the potential for follow-on proliferation as a result of Syrian unrest. And I think it's a very disturbing possibility.
I'd agree. The question, in case everybody didn't hear it, was are there any realistic scenarios or ongoing conflicts that could realistically result in nuclear weapons use? Is that a fair restatement? I think that there are two primary ones today. As a preface, I'd say that I think it's exceedingly unlikely that there would be use of nuclear weapons between the declared nuclear weapon states, between the so-called P5, Russia, France, UK, China, the United States. The two places in which I see there being some not insignificant possibility of use of a nuclear weapon are, one would be nuclear terrorism, and I detailed the reasons for that in my opening remarks. And second, I'm very concerned about developments in South Asia, the India-Pakistan case. Those are countries that are exceedingly hostile. They're on each other's borders. They both have significant nuclear arsenals, and both of them have significant terrorism threats that could be used either to spark a wider conventional and perhaps even nuclear conflict, or might be used to steal nuclear weapons and use them in that context. So those are the two scenarios that I would be most worried about, and I think that's where we have to spend most of our attention.
I would just add one quick footnote to that, and that is I also worry to some extent about regime collapse scenarios in some places like North Korea, or perhaps a future nuclear armed Iran. If it is not unimaginable that you could see sort of civil conflict scenarios of various sorts developing in either of those countries, either as a result of some kind of leadership succession crisis in North Korea in the midst of their current latest dynastic transition, or perhaps in some future regime collapse in Iran. And in that case, it's possible that particular institutions, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran, which is presumably going to be the guardians and gatekeepers of their weapons at such point as they have them, or whatever elements of the North Korean system are in charge of that stuff. If institutions like that end up being participants in some kind of internal civil conflict as the result of the collapse of one or both of those dictatorships, I would worry about potential for use either directly in that context or perhaps connecting to an international terrorism scenario. If indeed that kind of cataclysm internally, I think even less scrupulous than they have been to date about passing on material or perhaps weapons themselves to non-state actors. So additional wrinkle of regime collapse, but I think Will's got it quite right.
Thank you, gentlemen. I had a question regarding Iran. Unlike when the Israelis bombed Iraq and Syria, it would appear that the Iranian nuclear program is more perhaps redundant, and a strike might not significantly greater capabilities any longer. I've heard it would take a sustained bombing campaign to have an effect. The second part of the question is, if Iran goes nuclear, do you think it will facilitate an arms race in the Middle East?
Well, the IAEA has detailed several different sites in Iran where nuclear activities are taking place. So there's the reactor at Bushehr, although its connection to a weapons program is probably not direct. There's the enrichment facility at Natanz. There's a new enrichment facility near Qom. There's a uranium conversion facility at Esfahan. The latest report talked about work at a place called Parchin, which is a military base. There's been some concern that there might be facilities in or near Tehran. There is a heavy water reactor that's under construction in a place called Arak, A-R-A-K. So there are lots of facilities that would be relevant to a nuclear weapons program. And I assume that if someone were going to attack them, they would probably not go after just one of them. They'd have to go after all of them. And such attacks would also entail negating air defenses, which would be a further set of targets. And possibly air forces, although the Iranian Air Force isn't much of a factor these days. So I think your question, would it involve a sustained campaign? I think the answer to that is yes. If Iran were to attain a nuclear weapons capability, I think it might embolden Iran to pursue more vigorously the policies it's already pursued in the Middle East and in the region, in the Gulf. It backs terrorist organizations, Hezbollah, Hamas. It may become bolder in terms of trying to assert control over the Strait of Hormuz or oil prices. It might pursue its Shiite policies versus the Sunni states in the region more vigorously. In short, you'd see essentially a distillation of what you've already seen from Iran, pure reform.
I also suggest that the objective of any strike of that sort, I think it would indeed take something more like a campaign than just an afternoon of explosions. The objective of any such thing would be presumably not, it would be unrealistic, and I think people recognize this, to imagine that the program could be erased or full on stop. The game, if there is to be such a game, would be to get as much delay out of it as possible. Perhaps with some plan B in mind about how you handle Iran in this interim period before they manage to reconstitute and cross that line. There's no expectation, I suspect, that you'll get rid of all this stuff. There are presumably facilities that we don't know about, at least to some degree. I'm willing to believe we know a lot more than has been said publicly, but I'd be surprised if we knew everything. They're not stupid after all. So it would be a question of what you plan to do with delay, what you hope could happen during such a period as the delay took place. The Israeli hit on the Osirak reactor in '82 set the Iraqi program back by a number of years, long enough that through what turns out to be to some extent blind luck, we managed to crush their own forces and be able to inspect their country in 1991 before they had crossed that line. If the first Gulf War occurred later, who knows? But Osirak bought time in which other things can happen. One might perhaps hope to have other things happen in Iran. The regime is brittle. It has had its problems. I don't know what plan B is, whether it would just be a question of kicking the can down the road, but that might be deemed a better option even than just letting it progress today.
Literature has shown that Agent Khan was on the CIA watch list as early as 1974-75, and obviously his proliferation of nuclear technology and material led to India, North Korea, and Iran, as you alluded to. What changes in policy terms has the CIA made to prevent characters like Agent Khan to go as far as they did in mitigating and spreading nuclear technology?
Did everybody hear the question? Okay. I think the changes really have gone much beyond what the CIA does, and it's much more of a government-wide response. So A.Q. Khan's proliferation of material highlighted a gap in what we were doing. Our non-proliferation policy had been focused on states, not non-state actors, and our ability to interdict nuclear trafficking was not as robust as it needed to be. So the response was several-fold. First, we beefed up intelligence collection on those sorts of targets. Second, we created the Proliferation Security Initiative, under which 80 or so nations band together to exercise and then use their ability to interdict. An early example of that was a ship called the BBC China, which was headed to Libya, full of centrifuge parts. And in an operation that involved several countries, that ship was brought to port in Italy before it went on to Libya, and those parts were taken off. And I think there have been other cases in which materials have been stopped under the Proliferation Security Initiative. Third, the global initiative to combat nuclear terrorism improves export controls. And as I mentioned, the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 makes proliferation by non-state actors like the Khan organization illegal, or at least requires states to pass laws making that proliferation illegal. So it's been activity that's far beyond just the CIA. It's involved lots of agencies within the U.S. government and lots of other nations around the world.
Yes.
I heard something on the radio, or I read on the news or something about how Australia is going to go ahead and send material uranium to India. They have had a ban on it, but the current Prime Minister is asking to lift that ban so that they can be sending the stuff, I think it's cesium, that they're sending to, and the reasoning was is because, well, China sends it to them, we need to send it to them. And that to me sends a very weird message that, and I'm not sure what kind of responsibility statewide, and I just was wondering what your thoughts were on those lines of, well, they do it, we should do it, type of attitude, with nuclear capability.
My instinct would be that others can do or will or might do it, therefore we should do it, is not an adequate rationale. But that doesn't mean that there aren't good rationales for doing that sort of thing. The United States government has spent a lot of time and effort before 2005 to work out a sort of an opening to India in trying to elicit Indian cooperation in various ways of allowing the IAEA to inspect at least some of their facilities, achieving a separation between, for the first time, a clear separation between the sort of civilian peaceful side and the military side of their nuclear endeavors, and getting them to improve export controls and that kind of thing, as part of a broader policy opening to India under President Bush, and that approach has been ratified in practice by President Obama as well. So, I mean, clearly it's been the U.S. position that there are powerful reasons, policy reasons, to open to India. We spent a lot of time and effort persuading the nuclear suppliers group to allow an exception to India. The previous approach had been one that was very reticent to supply nuclear technology to countries outside the NPT. But India's record was deemed one that was, under their circumstances, deemed sufficiently different from other circumstances that it was an appropriate step. With big picture policy reasons to make that opening. Australia, in a sense, is simply, I suspect, following what is now a fairly well-trodden path, so I don't see it as that exceptional. I think the defensible reasons for that have to do with various questions of strategic and non-proliferation policy, and don't have to do with just the others will do it. And when I was on the Hill, I used to fight these export control fights a lot. One always heard from industry that, well, we should open up and not worry about who we sell high technology national security items to, because if we don't, the Europeans will sell or whatever else. In and of itself, it gives me no comfort to know that some industrialist in our country has made some money when something labeled made in USA lands on a friend of ours around the world. That's not an adequate reason in itself. There may be lots of reasons to do lots of policies, but, and I think India is quite defensible, but that's not it.
Yeah, I had a question about the sort of day-to-day policy making negotiation. With the easiness to get technology and information, and the possibility, or how easy I guess it is for non-state actors to acquire nuclear weapons and this information, when you're negotiating these policies, does there have to be a separation between when dealing with state proliferation and the possibility of a non-state actor these weapons, or do you deal with that kind of all together? Just wondering about the logic, I guess.
Well, as a practical matter, the people who deal with these issues are largely the same people. The policy tools you use are different. So if you're worried about proliferation by states, what you probably worry most about, for example, is the spread of enrichment, uranium enrichment, and reprocessing capability that can separate plutonium, the stuff that makes weapons. So Iran is working on, has an enrichment capability, is working on plutonium production capability, and so that's the focus of the effort. With respect to terrorism, the issue is more, no one seriously believes, that I know of anyway, that a terrorist group could make its own fissile material. It would have to steal a weapon or steal the fissile material. And so the policy tools there are to improve security, law enforcement, intelligence collection, the sorts of things that would help to defeat those efforts. So they're different policy tools, but the people who work on those problems at the State Department, the Defense Department, the National Security Council are largely the same people. Did that answer?
Yeah, I guess I didn't know if you approach like the same we're going to deal with Iran. You know, if we're going to deal with them, there's a difference in the way that you approach policy negotiation because you're afraid that if they do make the weapons, that's a problem. But if they do make the weapons, there's a separate problem that terrorist groups inside Iran can get those weapons. And if those are two separate conversations that you have with individuals who represent the state, or if that's part of the same big conversation, I guess.
Well, both of those problems, I think, are in the backs of the minds of the policymakers in Washington. I don't think there's ever been a discussion with Iranians about the notion that if they got a weapon, they might share it with terrorist groups. But of course, it's been discussed openly as a possible concern. And I know that in the wake of North Korea's nuclear test, there was a strong warning passed to Pyongyang that onward sharing of fissile material or a weapon would have severe consequences. Now, unfortunately, after that, the reactor in Syria was discovered. And while it may not have directly contravened the warning that was given to North Korea, it certainly was pretty close. And so I would say actually our declaratory policy in that regard needs some shoring up.
Thank you. The U.S. clearly has been saying to North Korea that six-party talks will be held under conditions that suspension of UEP program and the permit of nuclear inspectors with North Korea's nuclear renunciation as the most strong point. But North Korea has never followed it. And based on the IAEA reports, it raised the possibility of technology and information exchange between the North Korea and Iran and Pakistan. And all this current situation raised the opinion or prospect that the U.S. has to change their attitude from asking North Korea give up the nuclear program, instead putting more focus on the technology and information exchange between those countries. I'd like to hear your opinions about those opinion and prospect.
I personally think there is very little chance of successful nuclearization negotiations with North Korea at this point. They seem clearer than ever that they are committed to retaining these things, and that the conditions that they now talk about, to the extent that they're willing to talk about denuclearization at all, which is very limited, are ones that I think they know are essentially non-starters. The latest that I've heard from North Korean interlocutors revolves around the kinds of demands that they would make with the dissolution of the U.S.-South Korean military alliance, the removal of similar alliance commitments to Japan, verification visits by North Korean inspectors to U.S. nuclear facilities in the United States to make sure that North Korea is not targeted by U.S. nuclear weapons. So these are sort of fantastical things. And as they talk about denuclearization these days, folks from Pyongyang couple it with discussions of global nuclear disarmament. The message seems to be that we will consider getting rid of our weapons when all of you who possess nuclear weapons around the world also get rid of yours. So I think for the moment, denuclearization is a serious objective of the six-party talks process. It's sort of, and therefore the party talks themselves are largely off the table. And I think it is time for the outside world to spend more time focusing on how to manage and mitigate the threats that North Korean activity presents. Technology flows, stepping proliferation, stepping up PSI interdictions, making sure that this kind of onward flow of technology and know-how that's referred to in the reports you're talking about don't occur in the future. Managing the potential consequences of additional North Korean provocations. It's a time-tried strategy of crisis diplomacy that Pyongyang uses when it wants to get partners back to the negotiating table in a more conciliatory mood, that it commits some kind of an outrage and tests a weapon, ballistic missile developments, sinking a patrol vessel or someone else. So we need to be better prepared, I think, to manage the consequences of that kind of acting out than we perhaps are today, to think more explicitly and openly about things like consequence management and contingency planning for what should happen if the regime there in fact fell apart. That's, I suspect, been a quiet part of our diplomacy for a long time, but perhaps it's time to make that more overtly a part of how we think about this. If unitarization is indeed off the table, we need to be thinking about how to contain, box in, and manage the potential dangerous consequences of what that regime has and might do with the toys it refuses to get rid of. But that's just me.
A couple of years ago, there was a guest speaker from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in Atlanta in my class, and he was asked, what single country or region do you see as the biggest security threat to the United States? And he said Europe. And his reasoning was because of the free trade and the front companies that made it possible for the nuclear material to move around. How do you see the role of Europe in nuclear non-proliferation?
That's a very interesting question and a very interesting answer that you got. Trade in nuclear material or weapons-related material and technology was not controlled the way it should have been in the 1980s and 1990s. We talk about an A2CON network, but it's clear that one could easily have named the network after one or more European individuals and been just as accurate. But I wouldn't go nearly so far as to say that the number one threat to the United States arises from Europe. And I think European countries and companies have gotten much better at controlling technology. I think that the largest suppliers of illicit nuclear technology and materials are probably from China now, or they're from countries that no one would expect. So one of the things that surprised us about the CON organization was that they were manufacturing centrifuge parts in Malaysia. In Malaysia, if you ask any Malaysian government official in the early part of the last decade, well, do you have a big capacity to make nuclear relevant materials? They'd say no, we don't do that. And of course, CON was doing that unbeknownst to the government. So I think the primary threats in terms of illicit trafficking of nuclear-related technology are either China or other countries where the sort of targets of opportunity are used.
Yeah, I guess I should have pointed out that he also first mentioned the threat of nuclear weapons to land on the hands of terrorists. So he didn't say this as the first reason, that he saw that as a threat that it's hard to track down the material movement in Europe.
Well, I think the Europeans have gotten a lot better at it. There's a company called Label, which had very clearly provided nuclear relevant technology to proliferation programs, and I think was exposed for having done so. As a result, they've instituted a program that's much more rigorous in terms of compliance with both their export control obligations and their non-proliferation obligations. And they tend to work quite closely with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So if they see, for example, someone ordering parts that are just below the Nuclear Suppliers Group trigger list specifications, certain qualities of equipment, so if they're ordering just below the threshold that would make those exports impossible, they might still be trying to attain that capability. They'll go ahead and let the IAEA know this. So they're actually helping to detect illicit trafficking, which is a huge turnaround from decades past.
Currently, the 98 members, the most significant participants, in my opinion, the most significant country yet to join is China. Resolution 1540 gave a great general framework for the PSI to work in without deliberately naming the PSI, and then further resolutions specific to North Korea or Iran have given specific frameworks for the PSI to work in. What do you feel can be done to entice or get China to join on with the PSI?
Well, in some ways, I think China has chosen not to join PSI for the reasons we would want China in PSI, the opposite reasons. They see PSI as a means to threaten North Korea's ability to traffic illicit material, as a way to put a stranglehold on North Korea's nuclear program, and they're unwilling to apply that pressure. So I think what needs to be done is to fundamentally change the calculus in Beijing, which so far has been one that has assumed that anything that would threaten stability and place stability as their primary interest, as an outcome that would not be preferred. Rather, they would prefer just kind of kick the can on North Korea. So if you're asking me, well, what would bring China into a position where we would be more active on North Korea, I think it would be to convince China that North Korea's nuclear program is fundamentally not in China's interest. And the arguments that I would make, if I were going to make such a case, would be several-fold. First, it strengthens U.S. alliances with the ROK and Japan. They're in better shape today than they've been in decades, primarily because of the North Korean threat. Second, it increases U.S. interest in missile defenses. Third, it increases the salience of nuclear weapons. You see talk in both the ROK and in Japan of perhaps attaining a nuclear capability, which would not be in China's interest. Fourth, it makes the continued presence of U.S. troops on the Korean Peninsula more likely rather than less likely. All of those run against fundamental Chinese interests. And I'm hopeful that eventually we'll be able to make that case, but so far we haven't been able.
I should point out as well that it's, theoretically, it's not absolutely necessary that China sign on some dotted line as an official participant in PSI for it to be cooperative, and constructively so. I mean, if there is a political difficulty for some reason in Beijing with signing on to this sort of U.S.-led initiative and so forth, I suspect people in Washington would be perfectly happy that China does the right thing in cooperating with these kinds of policies, whether or not it officially calls itself a member of PSI. Right? The formalities are not that important. Indeed, it was one of the insights of PSI in the first place that we have spent far too long, obsessing about the formalities of institutional arrangements, and the way to really make progress without having to get wrapped around that axle is, in fact, to get people together at the point at which they agree on, they're like-minded, is the phrasing goes in the PSI world. The point at which they agree on substantive issues and are willing to cooperate on the basis of the powers and authorities and influence that they have. Whether they call themselves a member of PSI or not, whether they officially subscribe to the principles I'm less concerned with, though it would be very nice and it would be a very good thing, than how cooperative they in fact end up being in putting pressure on, for example, North Korea to refrain from doing many of the things that they have been trying to do to make progress on denuclearization. Those kinds of things are far more important than the official atmospherics of participation versus non-participation. I'm more interested in how cooperative they actually are, and if we can make the case to China that this really is in China's interest, and I think, I agree, it's a good case, and I hope that they come to see it. I'm less concerned about which dotted line they feel comfortable signing.
Yeah. What do you suppose motivated China and Russia to be so uncooperative with regard to containing Iran?
So uncooperative?
Yeah. It's almost as if they wanted Iran to have nukes.
Yeah. Well, it's an issue that's troubled me for a very long time because I worked on those issues in government. So if I were going to list the reasons why I think, obviously it's speculation, right? Nobody knows exactly what's going on in whose or Putin's head. But the reasons that I would come up with are different for Russia and China because they have different interests. For China, I think their primary interest is energy, and access to Iranian energy helps them. Conflict in the Middle East doesn't help them because the price of energy goes up. And then finally, they do have an aversion to what they see as meddling in other countries' internal affairs based on their history, or at least their view of their history. So I think that's what's motivating Beijing. On Russia, I actually could construct a case that there's good reason for Russia not to have this issue resolved. We've invested the Iran issue with enormous importance. And I heard a Russian say to a group, for the United States, Iran is perhaps your second most important security problem. For Russia, Iran nuclear is maybe 8th. With the reset, it might go to 6. But there's a difference between 2 and 6, and that difference has to be paid for. So they're transactional. Third, Russia used to have influence in lots of countries around the Middle East, which for one reason or another has fallen away. So Syria, Egypt, Libya, Iraq were all once toeholds in the Middle East for Russia, no longer really the case. Iran might be one of the few friends that they have in the region, and Iran needs friends. Fourth, Russia sells both military equipment and nuclear stuff to Iran, which they want to continue doing. So I think that there are, and then finally, the same incentives that apply to China, energy prices going up, work in reverse on Russia, right? If the price of oil goes up, that helps Russia. So those are all the kind of reasoned, well thought out answers. I'd add one final one that came from a colleague of mine at the Belfer School, or Belfer Center, which is that Russia's calculus is that the only thing worse than a nuclear Iran is a pissed off nuclear Iran. So if it's inevitable, you might as well just sort of go along with it.
I think that's all really astute. I'd add just a couple of wrinkles to it. I think there is a taste in modern Moscow for things that complicate the U.S. geopolitical equation. That's kind of fun. It kind of fits into a self-image as a global player, a feeling of continued rivalry with Washington that Washington hasn't felt for a long time with Moscow. And it probably bothers Moscow that Washington hasn't felt it that way. So it's actually, there's probably some psychic benefit there, perhaps perceived geopolitical benefit in making life a lot more complicated for our strategy in the Middle East. I agree with the petrodollar account. It is probably in Russia's interest that the Middle East not be utterly stable, perhaps. But that same factor, I think, at least holds up the possibility that China, at least at some point, maybe too late for Iran, right? But at least at some point could be persuaded that its interest, in fact, lies much more in line with those that we perceive in the West with regard to Iran. And that is the idea that my suspicion is China has probably not caught too very much about what a future Middle East looks like with a nuclear armed Iran. And one can, of course, construct all kinds of horrible scenarios in that respect that do not conduce to low and consistently available regional energy prices, right? So it is possible that China's very thirst for carbon fuel could be at some point the kernel of a decision that, oh my gosh, maybe this wasn't such a good idea after all. We should have been a little tougher on this. Maybe we could be more cooperative now. I don't know if that decision will happen or if it will come in time for it to make much difference in the Middle East. But I do agree it's very important that Moscow and Beijing's interests, I think at the end of the day, do point in very different directions in the Middle East. I hope China recognizes that sooner rather than later.
Well, I know our speaker can discuss this issue deep into the night, but I also know there are flights to catch. So I would like to thank first all of you for coming, and I would especially like to thank Dr. Ford and Mr. Tovey for your insightful comments.